There's one thing you must understand about learning. It's non-linear. Think about it. Everything in your life revolves around three things: time, organization, and lists. This is because your brain loves breaking things into chunks. It's how we process information. And while that works for some things, it doesn't work for learning. That's why most people walk away from studying remembering nothing. But you clicked on this video because you're ready to make a change. And you're probably expecting some top 1% student note-taking tricks, but frankly, those only take you so far. A system that actually helps you learn is built specifically for you. It's not some copy-paste garbage. So here's the plan. I'm sharing with you 3 steps to build a learning system that specifically works for you. By the end of this video, you'll learn how to make connections, weave all the information together, and forge it permanently in your memory. But first, you must understand the basics behind the psychology of memory. Your brain isn't a storage unit. It's not meant for hoarding information. It's meant to build connections between different ideas. Yet most classes are built around wordy, lecture-driven material that forces you to sit down and copy PowerPoints. However, this leads to your brain forgetting everything come exam day. So how do you use the psychology of memory to your advantage? Well, there's one key rule. You must actively engage. And my 3-step learning system will make sure you engage more than you ever thought possible. Step 1, Snatch. Step 2, Weave. Step 3, Forge. Now let's start with Snatch. In this first step, you're going to build a filter that only collects and prioritizes the most important information. This filter has 3 different layers, each serving a unique purpose. Let's start with the biggest and broadest, the big chunk layer. This is your first defense against useless information. Buzzwords, fluff, unrelated content. If it isn't a main idea, it's not getting through. There's 3 ways to spot what should actually make it through. First, look for pauses and emphasis. If your instructor slows down their speech or repeats something, you probably need to write it down. 2, direct exam hints. If the instructor says something like, "This will be on the test," that's obviously a green light to write it down now. And number 3, dramatic pauses. If they stop after saying something profound, write it down. Now, the information that makes it through this layer is worth writing down, but you still need a way to do that quickly and efficiently. That's where the second layer of the filter is going to come in, the rapid capture mesh. But before I cover that, make sure to leave a like and subscribe so other people can find content that helps them with self-improvement, productivity, and academics. Okay, now you can't let all of these great ideas just slip through your fingers. You need to constantly be throwing out your net, catching anything that could be worth your time. So instead of copying the PowerPoints word for word and writing down entire paragraphs, you need to streamline your notes. First, you need to write in bullet points, not paragraphs. Think of the information being presented to you in fragments. Don't waste your entire time writing down every single little piece. 2, write connections, not copies. Instead of copying exactly what your instructor is showing you, you need to find ways to connect these different ideas. Don't worry if you can't find relevant connections yet. That's something we're going to cover in step 2 of my learning system. But for now, we'll move on to the last layer of the information filter, the retention strainer. This layer is all about refining the current information collected before we move into the next step of building different connections. And this is the simplest thing I've shown you yet. All you have to do is ask yourself 3 different questions. If I had to explain this in one single tweet, what would I say? This helps you distill all of the different information into one core message. What are the main words that instantly bring the whole idea back in my mind? These are the main pieces that will remind you of the entire pie. Lastly, how can I compress this information through the use of visuals? Shorten processes by breaking them down into visual art charts. At this point, you've taken the overload of information presented in class and stripped it down to its raw form. But raw information alone will not be enough. You need to now transform this raw information to something tangible by forming relevant connections. We're now going to cover step number 2 of my learning system, weave. Throughout this step, you will connect the dots to find relevant information between ideas. And by the end, you will have an interconnected web of ideas and visuals to effortlessly recall information. And I know that was a lot. So let's look at one single method that can make all of that possible, the threading technique. There's just 5 different threads you must weave together to build your interconnected web. Thread number 1, identify common anchors. Before you can worry about connecting every single piece of information, you need to identify words or concepts that are repeated in multiple subjects. Let's look at the word equilibrium and how it's used in science and economics. Equilibrium in science means neither its motion or state of matter tend to change with time. Equilibrium in economics means the forces of supply and demand are both balanced. This is a real example of a word being found in two different subjects, but meaning almost the same thing. And you might not notice common anchors yet, but once you start looking, you're gonna find them everywhere, in recurring principles and repeated word usage. But now it's time to associate these common words with something more familiar. Thread number 2 is linking new to known. The brain remembers information best when it's connected to something that's already familiar. You need to put an emphasis on connecting new ideas to something you already understand. Here's 3 different ways you can do that effectively. First, ask yourself, where have I seen this before? Sometimes old information can be presented in a new way, and this can confuse us into thinking it's completely new. 2, you can find personal relevance, because if you connect something to your own life, it will stick. 3, you can search for a crossover between different subjects. Most classes tend to follow the same or similar patterns. You just have to find ways to connect them. When I first started learning supply and demand, it was difficult for me to understand why supply impacted price. However, once I found personal relevance, I realized it's just the same as limited edition sneakers selling for super high prices. As long as you continuously weave new ideas with things you already understand, recalling information will always be effortless. But this next thread is all about reinforcing the connections you just made. And this thread is absolutely crucial: building mental bridges. Most people stop before this step, but if you do that, you're going to be left with connections that are just unstable. But by utilizing the third thread, you're going to have concrete mental bridges that you can cross anytime you want. The first and quickest way to build mental bridges is through the use of analogies. This is because the brain loves patterns, and analogies give us something concrete to hold on to. So whenever possible, you need to create an analogy, even if it happens to be the weirdest thing in the world. The second way to build mental bridges isn't as quick, but it's just as effective. It's through the use of cause and effect chains. Almost no information in the world is alone. Everything exists in chains of logic. This is what gives things specific context and makes them actually important. You should try your best to remember information in a sequence of events. I'm gonna give you an example. Skipping workouts leads to lower muscle gain, which leads to higher metabolism, which leads to weight gain. This isn't just a list, it's a chain reaction from one thing to its real-world consequence. But simply recognizing these cause and effect chains isn't enough. You have to actively reinforce them. So when you're taking notes, don't just list information or ideas. You need to actively connect everything. You can use arrows, diagrams, symbols, literally anything you need to make sure you understand the flow of events. Then, when you're reviewing your notes, trace it back to the cause, and then try to predict the event that's gonna happen. With your mental bridges built, ideas no longer exist in isolation, and you're starting to get this interconnected web built. But connections alone aren't enough. Let's add another layer of understanding. And this is where the next thread comes in, layering context for depth. To truly master information, you need depth, the kind that allows you to explain, defend, and apply whatever you've learned effortlessly. And you can add so much depth just by thinking about 3 crucial angles. Number 1, different perspectives, the kind that challenge your current thinking. You must force yourself to think about things from different angles, otherwise your understanding is shallow. Let's stay with the economy example here. Supply and demand means 3 different things to 3 different people: a business owner, an economist, and a consumer. Economists think about how price changes depending on the supply and demand. Business owners think about scarcity's impact on value. And consumers, they just know they need to buy when there's a sale. Understanding all of those perspectives paints a much deeper picture of what supply and demand really is. The second angle that will add depth is time comparison. It will paint the picture of relevant historical context because ideas change over time. A great example of this can be seen with inflation. Today, central banks use interest rates to control the overall economy, and in the future it could be AI or automation. So when learning something new, ask yourself, what was this like in the past? What changed, and where is this heading? This will give you a perspective that allows you to see the parts that make up a whole. And the last angle fits right into that. You need to look at practical application to make things real. Sure, if you understand the causes of inflation throughout history, you'll be able to build a timeline. But to truly explain inflation, you need to understand its real-world impact. If you can't apply the idea, you don't really understand it. So make sure to challenge yourself by applying it to a real-world scenario and testing your knowledge. With depth added to your understanding, you now have a 3-dimensional view of the information. The final thread will lock everything in place. for instant recall. Thread number 5 is spatial anchoring, and it's a technique that transforms abstract ideas into a structured mental framework. Your brain naturally remembers visual layouts far better than raw information. So this thread is all about creating ways to visually represent information. And there is just one type of visual organization method that I personally recommend, and that is the mind map. The mind map is built directly into your notes, allowing for instant access whenever you could need it. Start by writing the central idea in the middle of your paper, then putting a box around it. From there, think of relevant questions, information, or facts. Create a little branch, then put a box around it until you have a visual representation of all of these different ideas. Another way to spatially anchor is through the use of exaggeration and imagery. Instead of memorizing all of Newton's different laws, just imagine he is dodging apples falling from a tree in slow motion. Don't be scared to get crazy. Your brain needs anchors that it can instantly recall and remember quickly. The more distinct and interactive your anchors, the easier they are to remember. And after step 1 and step 2, you've collected all the relevant information and organized it in a way that created an interconnected web of ideas. Right now, your knowledge is structured, layered, and deeply connected. But connections aren't enough if they just crumble underneath stress. That's where our final step comes in: forge. This is where you reinforce, solidify, and stress test all the information and connections you've already built. This will make sure your information is not just familiar, it's unshakable. There's just 3 different pillars you must build to make sure your foundation is unshakable. Pillar number 1, consolidation. After you collect and weave together all of your different information, I want you to take one more look through it, except this time you must have fresh eyes. Take a little bit away from your work or your notes. Go do something you enjoy. When you return, you're gonna have a slightly different perspective, maybe seeing things you missed or things that shouldn't be there. While looking through your notes, imagine yourself as the presenter. Consolidate all the information down to its key points. This will reinforce all of your knowledge just to its core basic essentials and allow you to see any gaps in your understanding. A way I do this is through the use of a summary doc. Collect all your relevant notes, assignments, and exam materials. At this point, they should all be interconnected and clearly structured. Open up a Word document or a Google document. This is where we're gonna put our summary. Every 4 lines, you need to summarize it in 1, and then so on throughout the entire document. This will force you to strip everything down just to its most basic components. And that's great, but this next pillar is gonna verify that everything you have is correct. Pillar number 2 is active verification. Most people assume they know something because they can understand it in that moment. But real understanding requires proving yourself wrong before the test does. So here's how you verify all of your knowledge. 1, you challenge your own notes. Look at everything you wrote and ask yourself 3 different questions. 1, did I oversimplify anything to the point where it lost meaning? 2, do I actually understand this, or do I just recognize the words? 3, if I had to defend this concept in a debate, where would I struggle? After that, you can use AI by feeding your notes into ChatGPT and asking it to do 2 things for you. 1, find gaps or inaccuracies in my understanding. This will have ChatGPT reveal anything you may have overlooked. 2, explain this concept in a way that challenges my current view. Once again, this will give you a new perspective, one that forces you to think outside of the box. If you repeat both those steps just a few times, you're surely gonna have everything memorized. And we will move on to pillar number 3, stress testing. Having information and connections that crumble under stress means you have no information at all, which is why this pillar is so critical. And I'm gonna give you 3 different methods to ensure, even in high stress moments, your brain will instantly recall information. Method number 1, the teaching method. Strip everything down to the essentials. If you can't teach something, you simply just don't know it. Imagine you're sitting across the table from a 10-year-old. Get rid of all the jargon in your speech and boil everything to its simplest component. This 10-year-old must understand and follow you throughout the entire conversation. If you struggle to explain that, you're hiding behind complexity instead of mastering the idea. Method number 2 is context switching. This is going to make sure your brain is agile and can think about many different topics at once. Use a software like Quizlet to constantly change the topic you're talking about. This will make sure you understand everything and you're not just making connections between 1 or 2 pieces. This is going to simulate real-world pressure because your test isn't going to go 1 chapter at a time. And method number 3 is the high-pressure simulation. You need to fire test your ideas. Because if you only study in calm conditions, your brain's going to forget everything when it actually counts. You need to simulate an exam environment. Set a timer to simulate the stress and the time crunch of the exam. Practice in a loud environment so you're immune to all the different distractions come exam day. And then use practice exams as if they're a real deal. No going back and altering your answers. Treat it as if it was the only test you could take. At this point, your knowledge isn't just memorized. It's actually been tested, woven together and forged permanently. If you use my 3-step system, you won't just memorize knowledge. You built connections, reinforced them, and then tested them under stress. Now, when it matters most, your brain will not hesitate. It's just going to execute. But mastering information is only part of the equation. If you're still following a few different productivity myths, you're sabotaging your progress without even knowing it. In my last video, I just covered the 5 productivity myths that are ruining your efficiency. Click in one of these spots to make sure you're not holding yourself back.